Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed and on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 189. Today we talk history, cobblestones, and beer as we go to Prague in the Czech Republic.
See one more cathedral. Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have some news stories for you. The first news story, if you happen to be flying British Airline in the near future, you might want to be nice to your flight attendant as he or she may not be working for pay. British Airline has asked at least some of their employees to either take 30 days off without pay or to work for 30 days without pay because of the financial difficulties in the airline industry at this time. Normally, a plane landing safely would not make it into the news because that happens so many times every day. But it did make the news recently when a Continental Airlines Boeing 777 flying from Brussels to New York landed as scheduled because on board during the flight, the pilot died. Fortunately, there were two co-pilots aboard this particular plane and they were able to carry on fine, but unfortunately, the pilot did not make it. Continental had a different problem this week that was more self-inflicted as they took two unaccompanied minors on two different flights and put them on the wrong planes so that they did not go to the destination they were supposed to go. They're going to work on that. And then in a good news item, Larry Miller, who's 46, fell overboard from a cruise ship, but fortunately was found 3 hours later. As the ship was leaving Port of Tampa, he decided it would be a good idea to get on top of the railing, to stand on the railing to get a better view of a boat as he passed it by. He slipped and fell overboard. As it turns out, that was not a good idea. For links to these stories as well as some other news stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Audrey Scott and Daniel Knoll from uncorneredmarket.com who've come to talk to us about Prague. Audrey and Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And hopefully this time it won't be Audrey, Daniel, and the dog at the guest house where you're staying.
I guess it depends on who walks by the door next.
We should mention that we're actually doing this interview over Skype, and Audrey and Daniel are in El Salvador right now. And sadly, we're not talking about El Salvador. We'll let them finish the trip there at least first. But we're talking about Prague, where you lived for 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, we lived there for 5 years, between 2001 and 2006.
And since 2006, you've been on the road and are traveling all over the world. So hopefully we'll get you back to talk about some other places, possibly El Salvador.
Possibly El Salvador, basically anywhere in Asia. Spent over a year and a half there as well.
But I put out a request recently saying what places would people really like to hear about, and Prague came up as one of the top places. And we connected on Twitter because you have lived there. You ended up, as I understand, since this is the second time we started this interview, moving to Prague without jobs. What drew you to Prague?
Well, besides the physical beauty of the city, what really drew us to Prague were the people we met when we were researching moving to Europe. And we connected with a few people online, and then we went to Prague and visited and interviewed people, as well as just met different expats and locals who were living there. And that was actually the deciding factor, was the people that we met in Prague.
And you say you were originally planning on staying how long in Prague?
We thought we would move and stay for about 2 years and then move on somewhere else, and we ended up staying for 5 years. After 2 years, we just were not necessarily getting started, but we had our own community, our jobs were set, and we were still exploring the Czech Republic as well as the rest of Europe, because Czech Republic's back dab in the middle of Europe, so it's easy to go to Berlin for a weekend or Vienna for a weekend or fly over to London. And it becomes quite addictive.
Many people have admitted to being drawn in and sucked into Prague. If you go to Prague and you speak to people that have lived there for a couple of years, or there's actually a growing batch of people who've lived there for 5, 10, 13, 15 years, they all say, well, I originally planned to stay here for 6 months and now I'm still here. It just has sort of an addictive quality to it. It's the Czech culture and the fact that it's smack dab in the middle of Europe, and you have access to so many beautiful places in Prague itself, in the Czech Republic, and then just around Europe, that it really becomes enamoring and addictive over time.
My next trip to Europe is in December, and Prague is one of the places on the short list that we are thinking about going to see. Why should I go to see Prague? Why should I make that the top of the list?
It's a gorgeous place. I mean, it probably has the best preserved medieval city in all of Europe. And that sounds very cliche and something like from a travel book. But when you're walking, you kind of walk through these small streets and you end up coming out on the Old Town Square, and you've got the teen church there. And if you're going there at Christmas time or in December, the whole square is going to be full of Christmas market stalls and the smell of glühwein or spiced wine.
It transports you in time, almost. I mean, that's the thing. Because it's one of the best preserved cities, because during World War II, it was one of the few places that, for all intents and purposes, really didn't get bombed. I mean, there were a few episodes, and that's why it's so well preserved. And the fact that it's so well preserved, you walk through the place, you absorb the atmosphere, and you get kind of wrapped up in the feeling of the place. And there's sort of a mysterious element because some of the buildings are 200, 300 plus years old. You get this sense like you're being transported back into time.
The downside of that is that in the old town, which is called Staroměstská, and Malastrana, which is across the river, unfortunately, it's quite touristy, meaning that as you walk in the main areas, you're going to find lots of souvenir stalls, and you're going to find lots of touristy restaurants and things like that. But it's possible still to find your way into back streets and to find shortcuts to try and avoid a lot of the touristy streets and the souvenir stands in your face at every corner and things like that. And that's the fun part, is kind of finding your way around the windy cobblestone streets and peeking in here and there in order to catch a church or something like that, but then getting lost again.
I'll go one further, actually, in terms of why you should visit Prague. You're choosing to visit Prague at a really interesting time of year, December. So obviously, it's going to be colder. It's going to be a little bit darker. Some people don't like that. That's why, of course, so many people choose to visit in the summertime. But
Right,
I think
exactly.
you'll find the Prague that you visit in December, at least in my opinion, is the real Prague. It just, winter sort of fits its personality. And that's not in a negative way. I just think it sort of fits the mysteriousness of the place, particularly if it begins to snow, the fog rolls in over the river and the castle, and it just creates something sort of fairy tale-like and storybook-like.
And I'll actually add on to that. People who live in Prague actually avoid the old town in the summertime because it's completely overrun with tourists.
Right.
If you go in December, you'll actually see a bit more of local flavor and local people and people going about their regular daily routines and things like that.
And when you were living in Prague and you had a friend come to visit, what did you take them to see? What's the must-see places in Prague?
There's the big three, and after the first 10 or 20 visitors, in fact, I think the second year that we were there, we entertained 30 visitors on our couch. It was a pretty popular destination. So the big three are obviously the castle, Pražský hrad, Charles Bridge, and the Old Town. Those are must-sees. I think you sort of tick those off the list fairly quickly, depending upon the amount of time that you have. And then it's really a matter of how much time do you have and how much exploring do you want to do to get sort of behind the scenes or under the skin of the real Prague.
And those are the places where the tourists are obviously going to go anyway. Where did you know about going because you were living there?
For us, we would always recommend that people walk in the residential neighborhoods because most tourists stop at the end of Wenceslas Square at the National Museum. It's kind of almost like the boundary. But if you keep walking and you turn off the main roads, you get into these beautiful residential areas with 19th century Art Nouveau and Art Deco buildings. And every time you look up, there's some sort of statue or there's some sort of mosaic. In the last decade, a lot of the buildings have been renovated. So it's also just all these different colors of pastels, pastel blues and pinks and peaches. But really it's just looking up and noticing all the details. For example, one of the buildings down the street from us had these great little frogs that came out at you. But if you never looked up, you wouldn't see it. Or Art Nouveau kind of Mucha-esque mosaics are all over Vinohrady, one of the residential neighborhoods. The other thing I would recommend is going to Vyšehrad, which is kind of the secondary castle. It's the older castle that's down the river a little bit. It's not as stunning as Prague Castle, but it has a beautiful garden there, and it also has a cemetery with all of the Czech greats, meaning all the famous artists and composers, and it's just really laid back, and you normally will find, not in December, but at least in springtime and summertime, you'll find families having picnics and just hanging out, people playing on the grass.
I think it's a great place to go in December as well, but that's just because I think it's sort of quintessentially Prague.
You can't really visit Prague without visiting a beer garden or a beer hall because the Czechs do make some of the best beer in the whole world. And if you really want to know about Czech culture, the Czech beer plays a big role in it. So in the summertime, going to beer gardens, for example, Latna, which is one of the parks that overlooks the Vltava River, there you find families, older people, younger people, everyone.
Professionals. Basically, at the end of the day, during the summer in Prague, you'll find at any one of the beer gardens, the young kids who just got out of school. You'll find punks. You'll find people in their business suits. You'll find families. This is what Prague is all about. It's about the people, all walks of life, all ages, spending time, taking advantage of the good weather, and having a beer. It's really not just the drink of choice, it's the meal of choice.
Yeah.
Well, last week's show was on Bavaria, so this apparently is turning into the amateur traveler tour of beer gardens of Europe. So
I think they do have the highest consumption of beer per capita. But Czech Republic, if you're looking just at countries, I think Czech Republic has the highest consumption.
The highest beer consumption per capita in the world.
Yeah.
And for good reasons. It really is terrific. I don't know that we would qualify as beer connoisseurs. I don't know what beer connoisseurs really are. We've tried a lot of beer, and we do enjoy it. And it's the one thing as we travel around the world, because beer is pretty much universally available, wine's a little bit more difficult.
Right.
We still long for a good slow draw of a Czech Pilsner in summertime.
So the Tecate is not really doing it for you.
It works. It works in the current context. But if we had a transporter available to us, we'd be in Prague at one of the beer gardens, Rigorovy Sady, or there was another small beer garden in the neighborhood that we lived called Vršovice. And if we could go back there in a snap of a finger, we would.
But what's actually really funny is where we are in Salvador, and one of the most popular beers is called Pilsner. So we're at the food festival today, and there's a big beer tent with Pilsner written on top. And it's just really funny because Pilsen is in the Czech Republic. It's a town. It's where they made Pilsner beer. And all over the world, you find Pilsner beer. It all goes back to the Czech Republic.
Interesting.
Or at that time, Czechoslovakia.
The Czechs have left a pretty firm thumbprint on the history of beer in the world.
And you talked about hanging out at the beer garden at the end of the day. Are there other places like that living in the city you would keep going back to?
I was going to say the beer gardens are what come to mind most. But actually, walking the residential streets...
The outlying residential neighborhoods.
And the parks that are in the residential neighborhoods.
Vinohrady probably being the one that most tourists, if they go and they have a couple of days and they finish the sort of main itinerary of the big three and the old town, if they venture out, they'll probably venture to Vinohrady. It's the closest residential area to the center of town, Old Town. And just, again, full of beautiful buildings, very nicely restored, tastefully restored, lots of details. And the neighborhoods there are full of little shops and vinarnas, wine bars, and pubs where you can get a beer pretty inexpensively. And
lots of fried food.
And lots of fried food, which is what Czech cuisine more or less is all about.
When you moved to Prague, what was the biggest surprise?
We were actually surprised at how cosmopolitan it was. And when I say cosmopolitan, maybe international is a better word, but within the first 6 months, we were going to film festivals and we were going to Balkan music concerts and we were going to classical music concerts. And it was like every few days there was something going on, some type of festival, some type of concert, some type of exhibition. And that surprised us. Prague is 1.2 million people. So it's not that huge of a city. And if you look at its population, it's quite homogenous. It's very Czech. But at the same time, it has a pretty thriving art scene that there's a lot going on. And so the first few years, actually, we had pretty active lives because we were constantly going out. And it also helped that one of the people that we met before I moved to Prague, her boyfriend ran an independent film cinema, a movie house. And so through him, we found out about all these different movie festivals and film festivals and concerts and things like that. So when we first moved, it was almost like, wow, this is actually more developed and more cosmopolitan than we actually expected.
And if you go in early summer or outside of late summer, and I say that because when August rolls around, everyone more or less is on vacation, it's really a good idea if you have any interest in music, particularly classical music, to take advantage of that. And not necessarily to buy the sort of prepackaged concerts from people in period outfits, but to go and seek out the Czech National Symphony Orchestra performances and the performances at some of the really terrific, beautiful venues. Classical music there is still relatively inexpensive when you compare it to performances, say, in the U.S. They'll have classical music festivals and bring international orchestras from all over the world to Prague at very accessible prices, again, in really beautiful venues. So if classical music is your thing, it's really something to take advantage and to go after the genuine article as opposed to, again, the people selling this sort of canned performances and period outfits. The same goes for sort of world music, particularly Balkan music. There's a pretty thriving Balkan music scene, a lot of young kids, 20s, 30-somethings, who go out during the week, weekends, a number of different music venues, and you can usually find live world music, Balkan music. That's also particularly satisfying.
Let me just add a few details to go with what Dan said. In terms of classical music, our favorite venue is the Rudolfinum, which is right on the river.
Okay.
And it hosts the Prague Spring Classical Music Festival as well as Prague Autumn Classical Music Festival. And then the Czech Symphony plays there throughout the year. But it's a beautiful, beautiful venue. And because it's small, you can't have a bad seat. I mean, even if you're all the way in the back or even if you're all the way in the front, it's great. And then there's also Obecní dům, which is called the Municipal House. And when you walk up to Obecní dům, which is a beautiful Art Nouveau building, you'll be surrounded by people in period costumes trying to sell you tickets. Basically, walk past them to the back to the cafe and bookshop, and that's where they sell tickets for the real shows at much cheaper prices and much better. And then the National Opera, again, if you just go there directly, go to the ticket office, the prices have probably gone up a bit, but a few years ago you could actually get tickets for a couple of dollars from the back and see some fantastic performances. Even if it's a Czech opera, they still have subtitles, and you're there for the music anyway. You're not necessarily there to understand everything. So there's just a lot going on. And for world music or Balkan music, Acropolis, Žižkov, one of the neighborhoods, Prague 3, is a great place to start with, as well as Roxy, which is in Prague 1.
In the old town.
In the old town. Okay. These are not fancy places. Roxy and Acropolis are pretty grungy. The beers are cheap, you're squished in, but you're going to have a great show.
And when you say Prague 1 versus Prague 3, that's a neighborhood?
Yeah, Prague is divided into neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods have numbers, Prague 1, Prague 2, Prague 3, and then they also have neighborhood names.
Okay.
So in Prague 1, you have the old town, Stará Městská, and then they call it lesser town, which is Malá Strana. And then in Prague 2, you have Vinohrady. Prague 3, you have Žižkov. And each neighborhood has its own feel. Like Žižkov, it's a bit grungier, but at the same time, it's also become a bit hip.
It's been sort of gentrified.
But you can still find these old grungy bars with workers in there. And I think it has the highest concentration of communists in all of Prague.
Interesting.
But it's a neat neighborhood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Historically, Prague was basically cobbled together from multiple cities. So each of these sort of residential areas or districts used to be towns unto themselves, and then were over the course of time incorporated into a larger city, which everyone knows as Prague. So those neighborhoods used to be cities or towns or villages unto themselves. Each of the little centers has almost its own little town square in its own infrastructure, as you might imagine a town might have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you start saying the names of different neighborhoods and places, I think of poor Cindy, the amateur traveler intern who has been transcribing episodes for me. The Czech language is a little more obtuse for those of us who speak English than some other languages in Europe. I'm assuming because it's a heavily tourist city, I can get by in English, but how did you deal with wanting to know a little more Czech or dealing with the Czech words or the Czech language?
Drink beer.
Oh, that's the secret.
Language.
Okay.
It is. We lived there for 5 years. We took some language lessons in the beginning, actually over the course of a couple of years. But I am convinced the best Czech that I ever spoke was there. We were there for about a year, I think. And it's probably the point at which I had consumed the most alcohol. It just led to an ability to run all of the consonants together properly, like a Czech might. So I say it jokingly, but I say it truthfully. And really, if you want to get sort of under the skin of Prague, the best way to do that is to go into one of these little neighborhood pubs, order a beer, and just sort of see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Don't be scared by going into a neighborhood pub where there's a lot of people drinking. Prague is still a relatively safe place, and you might have someone with their arm around you slobbering a little bit, but it's all good fun.
And that wasn't Daniel you were talking about here, I assume.
No. I try and keep them a little bit more.
I didn't know how much alcohol was necessary to speak Czech here. Okay.
Actually, at that particular event, Audrey held her own, but I'm not going to go any further than that. So for the casual visitor, 3, 7 days, or 10 days, the same trick in Prague and the Czech Republic applies as anywhere else. I think commit a handful of pleasantries.
Please, hello, goodbye.
Give a try, because they'll appreciate the deference to their language. Because I think more and more people there understand that their language is very difficult to speak. But if you speak English, that'll be enough to get by, particularly in the center of town and even outside of the center of town. I mean, Prague is more and more cosmopolitan with every day. There are, again, international companies there. It's not like it's the hinterlands.
And there's more Czechs who are traveling as well, and that also makes a difference. I will add as a caveat that when you are in the center of town, in Old Town, and you're in a relatively touristy restaurant and you're speaking English, I do know people who've had bad experiences there in that they've been overcharged or mysterious service charges occur on their bill, or the change just mysteriously disappears. I had a boss who was a really sweet British lady and just was constantly taken advantage of when she first arrived in Prague because
she was a sweet little
British lady. And so just beware that if you're in a place that's heavily touristed, just be on your guard for overcharging. I don't want to make Prague sound bad, but it's just something to be aware of, in that some of the restaurants and some of the people working downtown, they expect tourists to be a one-time thing. And so if you know a few words and you can greet someone in Czech, I think it makes a difference. Like if you can just say hello, thank you, I think it kind of separates you out a little bit. And another thing that Prague is known for are the rip-off taxis, which is kind of like every city basically in the world.
I think the guidebooks probably call out the taxis that are honest and reliable. There's a company called AAA Taxi. There's one called City Taxi. They're usually pretty honest. Again, the same rule goes, don't just roll out of the hotel that you're spending $150 a night for and expect the taxis there to be cheap.
Yeah.
You know, make a phone call beforehand or go a block or two down the street and hail a cab from there, and it's likely to be a third of the price.
And in terms of spending $150 a night for a hotel, do you have recommendations on lodging? I know some people have recommended staying a little further out of town and taking public transportation in.
Well, since we lived there, we never really stayed in hotels.
Sure.
We had a lot of friends who came, and most of them stayed with us, but a few didn't. If you've got a pretty nice budget, meaning close to $200 a night, a favorite of some of my friends' parents is a place called Uraka, and it's behind the castle in a really cute neighborhood called Mali Sviet, which means Little World. And it's an old renovated 18th century home with about 5 different rooms. And so each room is decorated in a different way, and it has a beautiful garden. Even if you don't stay there, you can go and have coffee and snacks and stuff in the garden, and it's great. For more budget accommodation, there's a hostel that opened up a few years ago, which is kind of hip and how would you describe
Budget boutique.
budget boutique? Yeah,
Okay.
and it's called Check-In, as in CZECHINN.
Chuckle.
It's actually in a cool neighborhood, and I'm a little bit biased because it's in the neighborhood we used to live in, but it's on the border of Vinohrady, Prague 2, and Vršovice, which is Prague 10. So you're kind of on the edge of pretty nice, renovated, kind of expat-y neighborhood, as well as a local neighborhood where there's some places that haven't been fully renovated.
Okay.
So you have a little bit of the grunge, you have a little bit of these small stores, but then the neighborhood's also quickly changing. So you got these beautiful parks and old buildings. And
it's still only 15 minutes from the very center of town. And it's also on the number 22 and number 23 tram lines, which are sort of the main tourist vein through town that will take you all the way up to the castle.
Okay. And getting around, public transportation is really what we're recommending, it sounds like. And why?
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's the best deal of the bunch, and it's also an experience. In a good way. The trams are terrific. They're quick, and I think also people will find them sort of historically relevant. One thing that the Soviets did very, very well in the Soviet Union and in the sort of former Soviet sphere is they developed very good public transportation systems, and Prague is certainly no exception.
And in terms of public transport, Dan mentioned the 22 or 23 tram. What we would always recommend to our friends visiting was to take the 22 or 23 tram all the way up above the castle. So to go across the river, go up above the castle, get off, and then walk through the castle, down the steps, through Mala Strana, and then across the Charles Bridge. And then once you got across the Charles Bridge, avoid going on a street called Karlova, because it's full of souvenir shops, and for us it was the worst street in Prague.
Okay.
Instead, when you come across the Charles Bridge, you find a doorway that's halfway open, and it's called the Karolinum, and it's part of Charles University, and it's just a really peaceful area. And you walk through there, and you walk basically through this area. There's a church there and a few other things in a courtyard, and you exit on the other side, and it almost spits you out directly on the Old Town Square. So you avoid all the nasty souvenir shops and people in your face, and you get this really peaceful garden and courtyard.
If overpriced, tacky souvenirs and tchotchke are your thing, we firmly recommend Karlova Ulice. If it's not, and sort of the real quiet Prague and a sculpture garden and some more beautiful buildings are your thing, the idea is to slip through this sort of hidden doorway, skirt all of that sort of cheap, tacky souvenirs and tchotchke, and spill yourself directly onto the Old Town Square.
Excellent. What was the best day you had in Prague?
Oh.
That's a difficult question.
Best day I had in Prague.
I actually think we made a note of this, but I can't remember what it was. It was probably in the springtime. Because if you live there and you live through a 3 or 4 month episode of a long winter, then you're really looking forward. You know, I don't remember it exactly, but there was one day in particular I think that we wrote about in our diaries. I'm not going to answer your question directly because we'll get around to it, I think, once we sort of remember it all. There are a number of different publications, like sort of time-out-like guides that get distributed weekly. It's a good idea to sort of pick those up, particularly if you have a little bit more time than, say, 3 days, to cobble together a little bit of an itinerary in terms of art exhibitions and music and venues and things like that, because there's always something.
I think we went to that cool children's artist.
Bjorn.
Yeah, we went to his exhibition at the castle. And then after that, we went to the Buddhist tea garden. And then I think we got a beer at Latna Park. And then we ended up in Žižkov at the music.
At Acropolis, the place that we recommended. And we saw a group of Finnish women called Vartina,
yeah, that used their voices as instruments.
And then we went to a party that night.
Yeah, that's right.
So it was like 6 or 7 different little things that we hadn't planned at all that day. We probably had a couple of these sort of what's going on in Prague type magazines and said, this sounds interesting, let's go out and see how the day unfolds. And it was really terrific. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, that's excellent. Thanks. As we go to wind this down, finish this sentence. You really know you're in Prague when what?
Not to get back to the beer, but you really know when you're in Prague. You really know you're in Prague. You're drinking a perfectly pulled Pilsner on a quasi-decrepit park bench in a park overlooking the Vltava River and Old Town, and all around you are people of every socioeconomic class and age, and dogs everywhere. Actually, Prague is great for dogs. And it's just late afternoon, everyone's in a good mood, and you're trying to decide whether you want to venture into having sausages for dinner at the local grill nearby.
Can I offer the short version?
Yeah, you can offer the short version.
You're in a smoky subterranean pub.
We got the summer version and the winter version.
People are speaking a foreign language which consists of virtually all consonants. You're enjoying the third of many beers, and you're pretty sure that Franz Kafka is somewhere in the room.
And if you had to summarize Prague in 3 words, what 3 words would they be?
Boy. I'm going to try not to say beer.
I was going to bet that beer was going to be one of the words, yeah.
Well, trust me, the beer is much better than their wine. Actually, if you go there and they try and say how great their wine is,
stick to the beer.
Stick to the beer. Let's see, 3 words.
I'm trying to find one word that says the architecture is spectacular and historical, but I'm trying
in one word.
In one word.
Well, we could go with architecture.
Architecture, beer, and I'd say genuine.
Okay.
The reason I say that is there's an element of Prague that puts on airs, and then there's an element of Prague that just is what it is. And if you get out of the old town, you find out about the Prague that just sort of is what it is. The people who go to work every day doing whatever they're doing, come back, taking care of their families, maybe having a beer. Family is really important to people in the Czech Republic. If you get outside of the old town and the people who are selling souvenirs and things like that, and you sort of live amongst them, that's what you realize. And if you're there for a few days and you happen to go to a pub or a restaurant in one of these neighborhoods, it's maybe not frequented by lots of tourists and has a few locals thrown in, you realize that's what it's all about. It's about enjoying life.
And as a tourist, if you're going into one of these local pubs, you're not going there for the food. So just put your expectations about great food aside.
Okay.
You're going there just for the experience.
For the experience.
Yeah. Prague does have good restaurants, but the local pubs are not. They're of a different category.
Audrey and Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us some about Prague.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
The travel resource that I'm going to suggest you take a look at today is called Travel Scoot. That's travel, SKOOT.com. And Travel Scoot will give you a good idea what to do in a particular location. You can search by zip code and then find different itineraries. So, for instance, near San Jose, I'm finding things like landmarks and sites in San Francisco, little and big museums in San Francisco, and eating in San Francisco. So check that out, travelscoot.com. In news of the community this week, I enjoyed meeting both Marty and David while I was up in San Francisco for a meetup of a different podcast that I listened to, Buzz Out Loud. That was great fun. I had mentioned on a recent show that I was interested in doing meetups in San Francisco, possibly San Jose, as well as Chicago and New York. Chicago at the end of July and New York in December. I've heard no interest so far, so we'll do that only if you want to. I got an email from Gabriel who had a couple questions. One, you used to have themed episodes, how to take travel photos, bad hotels, but there haven't been since I started listening about a year ago. Are there plans for themed episodes in the future? I have looked at doing some other themed episodes periodically. For instance, I want to do a budget travel episode, and I've looked at doing some other ones like volunteer travel, and it's just that I haven't got any particular guests lined up to do some of the ones that I had in mind. So still planning on doing them every once in a while, maybe every quarter or so. It just depends on me finding guests. Number 2, why are episodes 1 through 18 not in the archive? I thought it was actually episode 1 through 20. I could be wrong. They're not in the archive to make the feed for the show that would be read by iTunes or whatever your podcatcher software is shorter, and also because they're not as good. The show has gotten better over time, and some of those are a little painful for me to listen to. But they are available on the website. If you go to the episodes listing, all of the episodes for the Amateur Traveler going way back to episode 1 are listed, and you can go and download the files for all of the episodes. Gabriel also had a problem where the Krakow episode came out at only 2 minutes long. It was supposed to be longer than that. There was a problem with my hosting provider, and that did get fixed. If you got a shortened episode recently, you might try going to download that again, and that should be fixed now. With that, we will draw this episode to a close. If you have any comments or questions, send them to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave them at amateurtraveler.com as a comment on this episode, or ping me on Twitter, twitter.com/Chris2X. There's also a way to call. If you check out amateurtraveler.com/contact, you'll see a number for giving us a voice message. And as always, thanks so much for listening.